Good evening, everyone. My name is Janet Dolan, and on behalf of the Minnesota Peace Initiative, I would like to welcome you to this evening's program. I want to welcome back all of you who have attended past programs, and I've met several of you as I've tried to meet as many of you as I could before the program. And I also want to welcome all of you who are here for the first time. We also have another first this evening, which is we have, for our first time in our history, we are joined by sponsoring organizations. And tonight we have Global Minnesota, we have the Fredrickson and Byron Law Firm, and the Minnesota China Business Council. I will loop around and talk more about each of those sponsor organizations in our closing remarks. But I just want to open by saying we have members of those sponsoring organizations here, and we're very glad that you're here. For those of you who are attending for the first time, let me take a moment and tell you who we are and why we do these programs. The Minnesota Peace Initiative is part of the Norway House. Norway and our Norwegian ancestors have a long tradition as peacemakers. Norway is often a very trusted and neutral global partner that is asked to help resolve conflicts and to bring parties in conflict to the negotiating table. Therefore, as part of our Norway House here in Minnesota, we have established the Minnesota Peace Initiative as a forum for thoughtful discussions of current issues and conflicts, and it provides an opportunity, we hope, to listen and to learn from each other. In this politically divided culture, we often say to ourselves, why can't we just listen more to each other? So that is what we hope you can do tonight. The goal of the Minnesota Peace Initiative is to delve deeply into the challenging global issues of our day. We believe that a well-informed electorate is essential to an effective democracy. We try to bring you experts who share their knowledge and their insights so that you can become better informed about the important and timely topics of our day. Some of the topics that we've covered in the past include Islam in the West, Arab Spring, the conflict in the Ukraine, the impact of social media on world events, and how educating women and girls can create stability in emerging nations. While each of the programs that we've had in the past has been a very timely program about a current topic at the time, I do not remember one in which the events of the day were changing as rapidly as on this topic. Even as I spoke to our presenters today, this week, as I was planning, and I frequently call them and we do a lot of planning to get to this day, I would say to them, who knows where we will be with China on the day of the program. Our topic for this program could not be more important or timely. It is the new Silk Road, China's One Belt, One Road policy. We try to pick topics right out of the news, but rarely have we had a topic that is growing in importance and changing so rapidly as this topic. Just since we selected the topic, President Xi Jinping has sought and gotten the People's Party Congress the removal of term limits so he can serve as long as he chooses. The United States has imposed tariffs on China. While initially not wanting to retaliate, China is now imposing retaliatory tariffs. Kim Jong-un has traveled to China, the first time he's left his country since assuming power in 2011. And we cannot help but wonder how that visit is going to impact his anticipated upcoming meeting with President Trump. And just today, the United States pulled out of the seven-party Iran nuclear deal. This is bound to have an impact on the Middle East, which will impact all of Asia. So this is really a rapidly growing and rapidly changing topic. So what do we mean by the new Silk Road? You'll be hearing tonight from experts who will give you a much greater detail than I. However, I will share with you my bird's eye view of what the topic is. I'm keenly interested in ancient and medieval history. I've read a lot about pre-Greek Middle East, the Greek Republic, Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire, and European history through medieval times. Throughout all that time, China was the most developed economy and political system, and all roads led to China, particularly the Silk Road, which provided trade and communication between Europe, Middle East, Central Asia, and China. However, with the development of Western Europe and ultimately North America, the focus of Europe and Central Asia turned westward. Strong alliances between North America and Europe created the West. Now, however, we are seeing another realignment. Fueled by nationalism, Russia's effort to undermine Western alliances, the rise of China in both its capabilities and its ambitions, we are seeing again the specter of Europe and Central Asia turning eastward. To facilitate that, China is reviving its Silk Road. It is building transportation, communication, and other capabilities to facilitate the ease with which Europe, the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia can be linked to China by both land and by sea. This is called the One Belt, One Road Initiative. For brevity, we will refer to it tonight by its acronym, BRI, for Belt Road Initiative. We have with us tonight two panelists who have a deep understanding and knowledge of this topic. They will share with you their perspectives. We also have our superb Minnesota Peace Initiative member, Tom Hanson, who will lay the foundation upon which the rest of our discussion will be based. Tom is, and he likes this term, a recovering U.S. State Department diplomat whose expertise and experience is in Russia and Eurasia. Tom is currently the diplomat in residence with the Royal Allworth Institute for International Studies at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. Our two speakers are Dr. Carla J. Freeman, Director of Foreign Policy Institute and an Associate Research Professor of China Studies at Johns Hopkins University in Washington, D.C., and Jonathan Hillman, Fellow and Director of the Reconnecting Asia Project of the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, D.C. We will begin the program with Tom, a member of our committee and past panelist, who will introduce the subject and our speakers. Following the introduction of our speakers, each will give opening remarks. Following that, I will lead the panel discussion on some important facets of the topic. We will conclude with your questions. Your questions are very important to our program. We will be passing out cards, and you will have the opportunity to submit your questions, and I encourage you to submit them as early as you can. I will continue to ask questions of our panelists, but I will start clustering the questions I get from you so we can get to as many as possible throughout the program. Based on past experience, I can tell you the time flies by, so I urge you to submit your questions and become engaged in this very important topic of the 21st century. It's now my pleasure to introduce Tom Hanson. Tom is, as he says, a recovering U.S. Foreign Service officer with the Department of State, and his diplomatic postings have included East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. He's also active in many international organizations, and he is the chairman of our local Council on Foreign Affairs. He speaks extensively throughout the world on topics of diplomacy and international relations. And I can attest to this because every time I try to contact Tom, he is in some remote part of the world. So he leads a very charmed life. So with that, I'm glad to turn the podium over to Tom.
Thank you, Janet, and welcome everyone. You know, beneath the flotsam and jetsam and sort of surface news reports that we are awash in these days, there are deep changes happening in the global economy, deep tectonic shifts, and that's our topic tonight. The new Chinese initiative of a new Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, is potentially a game changer, something that may influence the patterns of nearly 500 years of global economic structures. We have, to my mind, two of the absolute best experts on this subject tonight. Jonathan Hillman is an unparalleled expert on the actual on-the-ground development of One Belt, One Road. He travels in the region. He takes coastal steamers and trains through this new reality. And we're very happy to have him here tonight. And Carla Freeman is one of the very top experts on China, and will put this into a perspective in terms of Chinese domestic and foreign policy. What exactly are the goals that China is pursuing? But beneath our topic tonight, there is a deeper, shall we say, geopolitical reality that is unfolding. Through much of history, this, what is now called the Silk Road, basically Eurasia, has been at the center of global politics and economics. It's really been the fulcrum of development for centuries, whether during the epoch of ancient Rome, when Rome was connected with the Han dynasty through trade routes across Eurasia, whether during Islam's golden age under the Abbasid Empire, which was in contact with the Tang dynasty in China. This was a very active stage of the Silk Road. Several of the world's largest cities at the time, Baghdad, Merv, were a part of this Silk Road structure across Eurasia. Now, in modern times, this has shifted for a variety of reasons. There were three blows to the old Silk Road starting in about the 1200s. First, the Mongol invasions, which destroyed a city like Merv totally, basically destroyed Baghdad. The great centers of the Silk Road were no more. Trade continued for the next century, but was a shadow of its former self. Then the Great Plague, which began in China in the 1200s and spread across, 1300s rather, spread across Eurasia, right through the Silk Road to Western Europe. A country like Norway had 60% of its citizens die within 3 months. This further decimated the Silk Road. And then finally, when the capital of Constantinople fell, the road was pretty much blocked off to Europe. This led to the voyages of discovery, whether Vasco da Gama or Christopher Columbus, and eventually to the new maritime structure of world trade that has dominated global commerce since the 1500s. Now, this pattern, whether you call it the maritime shift, which some people do, has been our reality. And the pathways of empire, the pathways of trade have gone by sea. This is true today as well with containerization. Vast amounts of goods can be transported by sea. The question before us today is to what degree this may change now, what degree it will change quickly or not so quickly. Already in 1900, a famous geopolitician in Britain named Halford Mackinder saw a shift. He said that the future will describe the last 400 years at his time as the Columbian epoch, the epoch of Columbus, and will say it ended in 1900. This was his projection based on railroads, because before World War I, the Baghdad Railway that the Germans were building, the Trans-Siberian Railway, the idea that rail travel would allow Eurasia to come together was a novel idea. And by the way, for China's new Silk Road, rail is the key. Magnetic levitation, maglev trains that leave the track are held by magnetism, reach speeds of 510 kilometers an hour. These technologies are part of the Silk Road project. He also predicted in 1900 that the domination by the coastal fringes of Eurasia over the Eurasian landmass would soon end. Now, in the 20th century, this was not to be. The great European wars of 1914 to 1945 left Eurasia fragmented with basically a maritime trade structure under U.S. auspices and U.S. institutions ensuing in 1945. But the shift has been underway now for a number of decades. In 1978, Deng Xiaoping announced the opening of the Chinese economy. This December, we will celebrate the 40th anniversary, this December, of the opening of China under Deng Xiaoping. 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed into 15 republics, and in the early 1990s, India began to open up. Suddenly, a fractured Eurasia was potentially back in the game, and the idea of a new Silk Road began to rise. One of the first persons to focus on this potential was Hillary Clinton. She gave a speech on July 20th, 2011, in Chennai, India, announcing the U.S. intent to help foster a new Silk Road. Now, this was to be tied in with our involvement in Afghanistan. The idea is let's weave Afghanistan into an infrastructure that we would help to promote as a way of getting out of this. David Petraeus was for this idea. People like Richard Holbrooke opposed it. And whether they were for it or against, this was a notional idea. We had no resources to actually do it. It was underfunded, and it disappeared. But just 2 years later, China announced its new Silk Road initiative in 2013. John and Carla will describe the details. So far, $1.4 trillion have been promised by China. There's real money there. They've set up an infrastructure investment bank, the AIIB. There's a maritime aspect to this, which could weave Africa in potentially. And as the far north melts, there's a potential of a polar Silk Road across Eurasia, depending on global warming. How are we reacting to this? What is the United States' reaction to this? Something that we ourselves actually proposed in 2011. Well, Obama refused to join the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and tried to get our allies to stay away. David Cameron of the United Kingdom thereupon announced that Britain wanted to be a founding member, and all of our allies tumbled on board. There are now almost 70 countries involved in the new Silk Road with China. We are telling our allies to stay away. This is not transparent, we're saying. Wouldn't we rather have high-quality infrastructure? How about debt servitude if you take loans from China? We're offering up all these arguments, but it's going forward nonetheless. And so our most recent repost to this came in our national security document, which was released early this year, in which we declared not terrorism any longer, but the rise of revisionist powers to be the principal threat facing the U.S. And of course, by that we mean China and Russia. We see what China is doing as a challenge. As Jim Mattis said last year, no one country should be able to dictate one belt and one road. Are the Chinese, in fact, dictating this? That's a question for this evening. We have said now we want to stand up against these revisionist powers and especially against Chinese economic initiatives. We don't want parallel structures to the ones we created in 1945. Our idea is to foster an Indo-Pacific, and in that regard to work with India, with Japan, with Australia. The problem is the same as it was when Hillary announced her intent. There's no money there. We do not do infrastructure. And in fact, we're responding to this now by increasing our defense budget by nearly $100 billion in the coming year, which is not really an infrastructure program. Now, before I introduce our speakers now, I just want to say that this is a long-term prospect that's developing now. It's very embryonic. We'll hear what's actually happening. But there are questions already that rise. Number one, can the transatlantic relationship, which has dominated world politics for the past centuries, with its 1945 vintage economic institutions, can that relationship remain the fulcrum of the world economy and the norm setter going forward? And second, can this process, which, as I said before, has deep geopolitical roots, can it move forward peacefully to the benefit of all? These are open questions, and we're very happy to have with us tonight our two speakers. Jonathan Hillman will start. He's a fellow at CSIS, Center for Strategic International Studies in Washington, director of the Reconnecting Asian Project. He is mapping and analyzing these new roads, railways, ports, and other superstructure that's emerging. He's a contributor to U.S. media, Wall Street Journal, LA Times, and National Interest, and others. Jonathan, we're very happy to have you here. And Carla Freeman, the Director of Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins, Associate Director of the China Studies Program. She is one of our most experienced experts on China and will give us the perspective of China on this challenge that we face. So we'll begin. I'd like to ask both of you to come up now. We'll start with Jonathan and then with Carla. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Thank you, Janet, and thank you to Norway House for organizing the event and also the other sponsors that helped make this possible. I thought what I would do briefly is show you just one project, one infrastructure project. We're tracking about 2,300 infrastructure projects at CSIS, and everything I'm going to show you is available on our website, reconnectingasia.csis.org. And we're tracking what China is doing, but also what others are doing, what Japan is doing, what India is doing. We focused on the Eurasian supercontinent for now, which, as Tom said, invoking Mackinder, has been historically has been the proving ground for great powers. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative stretches beyond the Eurasian landmass. It goes into Africa. It even goes into Central America by some definitions. In fact, when Jerry Brown visited Beijing last year, Chinese media said perhaps California is joining the Belt and Road. So this is an initiative that knows no bounds and continues to expand. But I think ultimately it's going to be judged on its economic merits and the degree to which these projects, these individual projects, are actually successful. We're looking at an area that's not far from the border between Kazakhstan and China. And now this is close to the definition of the middle of nowhere. And it's a photo of 2010. You can see that there's not much there. It's really, you're looking at some grass and some dirt. If we flash forward to just last year, this is the exact same location. And what you're seeing is a new logistics center that has sprung up. It's run by state-of-the-art company, Dubai Port World. It now has Chinese investment and Kazakh investment in it. It's a flagship Belt and Road project. And there have been many bold predictions given about what this project will do economically, like have been given for other Belt and Road projects. So some of the proponents claim that traffic through this area, rail traffic, which I'll show you in a minute, would grow by 20-fold within a matter of 5 or 6 years. They said that this area, the economic activity would create an additional 50,000 jobs, which, to give you a sense, that would be like double. That would be like taking like 40% of the existing population of that area and adding it. So it's a huge, potentially huge transformation for this area, but one that's going to ultimately depend on whether enough traffic goes through here. This is a picture of what it looks like on the ground. I had a chance to visit this area about a year ago, and what you're looking at is a massive crane that's designed to transfer cargo from one train to another. And so on the left, you can see the Chinese track, which is a narrow gauge, or narrower gauge. It's actually called standard gauge. But on the right, you have the Kazakh track, which is broader. It's former Soviet gauge. And so this crane takes rail cargo and transfers it from one track to another because the gauge changes at the border. Now, the economic case for rail has really changed dramatically over the last 10 years, due in large part to China's investment in facilities like these and also its subsidization of rail freight. And so the business case for rail is that it's about twice as fast as shipping, so going by sea, and it's only half as expensive as sending goods by air. So if you're able to do that, you're able to maybe bring down some of your inventory costs, and that's why you have a few companies, including US companies like Hewlett-Packard, shipping often from Western China, using these new rail services to destinations in Europe. And in fact, only a decade ago, there were almost no reliable services, no weekly services connecting Chinese cities and European cities. Today, about 34 European cities and 35 Chinese cities are connected by these services. And the amount of time that it takes has dramatically decreased to send goods by rail from China to Europe. And so we see these new services taking off. I think this is evidence that something is happening. Changes are happening both on the ground and potentially, could impact the flow of goods, potentially even the flow of people at some point. But the success of these routes is definitely not assured. They're heavily subsidized by the Chinese government currently. And then there's some other structural challenges as well. So there's a big trade imbalance between Europe and China. And so many of these shipping containers, when they reach Europe, there's not enough demand to fill them and send them back by rail. So sometimes they come back empty, partially full. Sometimes they come back by the sea. And so I think that this is, indicative, again, of the most ambitious dimension of the Belt and Road, I do believe, are these new overland routes. China is also investing in the maritime domain, and we can talk about that as well. But to me, this is one of the more recent developments, and certainly, I think its prospects are a little bit it's a little bit too early to judge with confidence. Now, if you look at some of these routes, they obviously have to pass through multiple countries before they get from China to Europe. And I think what this reminds us is that ultimately China's own plans are going to depend heavily on what other countries are pursuing. And so the Belt and Road is increasingly, I think, viewed as a very ambitious vision for regional connectivity, but we have to remember it's not the only vision. And so I like to think of Russia here as kind of a gatekeeper, especially if you're looking at rail between Europe and China. And so the success of those Chinese rail services are going to depend on their ability to get Russia to cooperate, not only with Russia's border with China, but the broader Eurasian Economic Union of which Russia leads. And it's a reminder that also the soft infrastructure matters here as well. So I've been to certain areas where, border crossings in particular, where the roads are in great condition, but it'll take hours to cross because of customs procedures, and guards will want more than just your paperwork sometimes. And so these are all I think, these issues go together. You can't have just the new rail track. You also need to work out some of the customs. Some of the legal regimes need to be aligned. Japan is also heavily involved in this game too, and I think it would be, this is sometimes surprising to some people, but in our database, we have Japan outspending China and Southeast Asia. And in many respects, Japan is the incumbent in that region, having been building infrastructure there for decades. And it brings, both relationships and certainly financial resources as well. It's unveiled what it refers to as the Partnership for Quality Infrastructure, a not too subtle dig at Chinese infrastructure, and it's backed that with $200 billion. And for context, the U.S. is going to, I think, struggle to pull together $200 billion in federal funding to spend on infrastructure within our country. And so this is Japan's investment for infrastructure beyond its borders. India is another important player as well. Although its vision is more focused internally, it does have a few key projects, including a port in Iran that is in many ways a response to a port that China has been building in Pakistan. And India is also involved in transportation corridors that go from north to south and could potentially connect Russia, India, and countries in between. And so I mention this because I think that when we consider both the potential for the Belt and Road and current reactions to it, all of these players and more, there are many more that we could mention, they all have their own individual views for how these new connections should unfold, their own interests to advance. And so China's ability to work with these partners, potential partners, to co-opt them, to convince them that its vision supports their interests is an important part of this. So that's just one project. Again, we have all of this on our website, and including the maritime dimension too, which I'm hoping we'll get a chance to address as well. But I just thought that would be helpful just to get you on the ground for a second before we take it back up. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It was a pleasure to meet many of you before tonight's program, and my appreciation goes to all of you for your interest. I also want to thank Janet Dolan and Tom Hanson for thinking of me, inviting me, and also the Norway House and Minnesota Peace Initiative. It's really important work that you're doing, and I'm honored really to be here to join you tonight. I didn't bring any maps for you because when I was looking for them, they were all on Jonathan's website. So I do suggest, I think everything about the Belt and Road is on that website. So I just have a few slides to punctuate some of my remarks. We're not actually going to get to that for a little while, but as Jonathan suggested, and indeed Tom as well, the Belt and Road Initiative, or strategy, and we can discuss that, is a breathtaking proposal in its scope. In its ambitions for global connectivity, some have seen it as the antidote to the distances that the historian Ferdinand Brodel termed enemy number one of civilization. But it has made others, just the other day, for example, James Millward, who's an historian at Georgetown University, reflect on whether or not the rails and ports that China now has such high stakes in all around the world are making China a colonial power. If this is so, this is no small irony, of course, because China's own early 20th century history included seeing its territory besieged by the West's crusade for commerce, and swaths of Manchuria grabbed by Russia and Japan as they laid down tracks for their own railways and also imported troops to guard those. I don't think it's clear what the BRI is yet. It's certainly a big advertisement for China's capabilities in the infrastructure development area. It's also an effort by Beijing to solve several important domestic economic challenges, and I'll talk about those a little bit more later. Beyond that, it's also clearly the export of a Chinese view for a better world, what Xi Jinping calls the China dream. This is a world that China believes is going to serve its own economic and political interests, and a world that it contends is better for all of us. And in this respect, it is absolutely, undoubtedly a gambit by China to lead change in the world. Talk of the Silk Road always makes people wax poetic, and China likes to talk about the BRI and link it to the Silk Road history. Although the Silk Road itself arguably brought more ideas into China than it shipped out silk to places like Rome during the Han Dynasty. But the BRI is really, if you're looking for historical precedents, more about China's own long history and understanding of the importance of infrastructure development. For China, China's own civilization owes a lot to infrastructure development, the infrastructure development that allowed connectivity around a vast empire. It was for China, in ancient China, it was the network of canals that facilitated imperial control, long before there was what the Chinese now like to call the Chinese development model based on road building. Even when China launched its reforms, as Tom mentioned, in 1978 under Deng Xiaoping, it immediately began to build roads and expand its railways, linking centers of economic activity across all of China and connecting Beijing to far west, Tibet and Xinjiang. The Belt and Road is more than a modern Silk Road because it's also a reformulation of ideas that have been imagined by visionaries for a long time. And in the 1990s, as I think was mentioned, it was the Japanese who led the charge to take advantage of the opportunity presented by the collapse of the Soviet Empire to establish new connectivity through the Eurasian rail land bridge that would enable new flows of energy and other resources for transformation into Japanese exports. Japan's was mainly a vision of trade and its own economic security, but there were those even then who saw resonances in Mackinder's heartland theory. And in the last turn of the century, Oxford historian John Mackinder, as Tom mentioned, felt that railroad technology would allow for a global hegemon, a single country to dominate the world, since railroads, with their capacity to move not just goods and travelers, but also troops, enabled the conquest of what Mackinder called the heartland, from Eurasia, from the Volga to the Yangtze, and from the Himalayas to the Arctic. If the vision of a Eurasian land bridge that's now China's BRI evokes Mackinder's, the BRI's maritime counterpart inspires readings of Alfred Thayer Mann, the naval strategist who believed effective use of the sea in both peace and war was key to national greatness, and who was a favorite, by the way, of Teddy Roosevelt, a U.S. president to whom Xi Jinping is sometimes compared. It isn't clear, however, that China's BRI owes much to either Mackinder or to Mann. It's a grand vision of global connectivity, but China's promotion of it under Xi Jinping's leadership may have begun at least, less to do with geoeconomic and geopolitical objectives than with some domestic concerns, and thus my first slide. The BRI is the policy of a government whose political legitimacy rests on its ability to deliver development, and that means to deliver economic growth. And China wants to keep its economy growing, and it has done spectacularly over the last 40 years. It started in 1978 with a per capita income of about $165, and now its per capita income is well over $8,000. But its economy is not growing the way it used to. It's now growing at about 6.5%, if you believe China's figures. China's Belt and Road is an economic policy to keep China's economy growing by expanding exports to new markets and investment in order to export Chinese manufactured goods, and also what is often called China's overcapacity. China just produces way too much steel, way too much cement and aluminum, all of these materials that are really useful in building infrastructure. And the companies that have been doing most of this work are state-owned companies. They're very important to China's economy, and they also have an important role in China's political system. Some of them are now some of the world's largest companies, producers of steel and so forth. And they represent as much as 45% of China's corporate profits, for example, and around 20% of China's employment. So piggybacking, and also piggybacking on all of these state-owned enterprises are other national champions in the high-tech sector, and these see growth potential along the Silk Road. So this is only one of the rationales for China's BRI, but it's a very important part. And the slides that I have up there just show you, just illustrate how much infrastructure spending is important to China's growth, and then the role of the SOEs, the state-owned enterprises, in that process. My second slide is very different. It's a picture of Xi Jinping as a young man in Shanxi province, where Xi has deep family ties. Shanxi is Xi's home province. It also happens to have played a very important role in China's communist revolution. During Mao's revolution, when when educated youth were sent down to the countryside to be re-educated, the then teenaged Xi Jinping was sent to do labor in Shanxi, affirming his ancestral roots. His family was Shanxi, but also spending time not only where the Mao's revolution was strengthened, but also in the province that was the heart of the Tang Dynasty and an important destination on the Silk Road. During his years in Shanxi, Xi built a very important a group of the so-called Shanxi Gang, a very important group in the Chinese Communist Party. So Shanxi is in western China, and in its capital today, Xi'an, or Chang'an as it was called during the starting point, during the Tang Dynasty, was the starting point of the ancient Silk Road. And so it's where this vision of linking China's hinterland to Europe has been discussed for literally decades as an antidote to this landlocked, very poor region's economy. So again, Xi has appointed quite a few people with Shanxi ties to very high positions in the central government, and they have helped push along this vision of the BRI. So what I wanted to illustrate with this story and this picture of Xi just is how important this is to President Xi Jinping. This is his vision. He's personally deeply invested and has been for decades. He's made the BRI his signature project, and it was, I think, as Tom mentioned, enshrined in the Chinese Communist Party Constitution at the Chinese Communist Party's National Congress last year. My third slide is a picture of the foreign ministers of China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan who are wrapping up a trilateral discussion about the Belt and Road last year. And I'm sharing this slide to illustrate how China sees the Belt and Road as a tool to deal with transnational threats. China shares borders with both of these very unstable countries, and their instability could spill over into Chinese society. And the threats to stability, to China's stability, are magnified by the fact that China has a large, maybe 12 to 15 million person ethnic Turkic Muslim population in western China, bordering Pakistan and Afghanistan. And China hopes that the Belt and Road Economic Corridor will help bring what it calls peaceful development to this region, that is stabilizing growth, satisfying people's aspirations so that they become stakeholders in stability. Finally, my fourth slide gets to the strategic value of the BRI, at least the potential strategic value of the BRI to China. It's pictures of two ports on China's maritime Silk Road. Hambantota in Sri Lanka, which since last December China holds a 99-year lease on, after Sri Lanka found itself unable to meet its $8 billion in debt obligations to Chinese firms. And then Piraeus in Greece, on which China now has, I think it's up to a 50-year lease. These are only two of a vast network of ports that China now controls or has a controlling interest in, and they give China a presence in the contested Indian Ocean, in the Mediterranean, where China now conducts naval drills. These ports remain commercial endeavors. They're mainly run by some of China's large state-owned companies, COSCO and China Marine. These are companies that are huge. COSCO, for example, has the world's largest fleet size. This has just happened in the last couple of years, and it's growing. This is a company that was started in 2005. But these ports are all configured so that they can accommodate naval vessels. Chinese leaders insist that their vision is a vision for all, an effort to create new opportunities for commerce and exchange around the world, to serve a vision that President Xi calls a shared future for mankind. But even if China's goal is to create a self-reinforcing dynamic of economic growth and development, the BRI has also made China's global ambitions very clear, and this has triggered a negative response in Washington, which sees many of these activities not only as a risk to smaller countries, which, like Sri Lanka, may become indebted or may see corrupt regimes kept afloat by the influx of money, It's also seen by many in Washington as a threat to American interests and to our global leadership, although others, Hewlett-Packard was mentioned, other companies see significant opportunities for the American economy. We don't yet have a national policy on how to respond to the Belt and Road. We have a vague concept for the maritime part of the Belt and Road, the Indo-Pacific concept, but it's not clear that we're talking about how to respond in Washington, except, as Tom mentioned, to strengthen our military budget. We aren't really talking about how we might get involved on the commercial side. I look forward to discussing that and other questions with all of you this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're now going to start handing out cards. If you have any questions as we go through, I encourage you to write them down and hand them out back to the center aisles. And Robin and her team will pick them up, and I will try to incorporate them into your questions. Before we begin, I want to start with Jonathan on infrastructure, but sometimes it helps to just have somebody's personal experience. I've been going to China since the mid-'80s, and I don't think anyone can, unless you've been there many times over 30 years, begin to appreciate the change and the investment in infrastructure that has taken place. I'll just give you a slight example. I was there in October, and we were talking about these high-speed trains that run on electromagnetic fields. And I think we all know our late-night comics crack jokes about how our infrastructure is crumbling. Ours was built 150 years ago, and our subways and our airports and everything are crumbling. And so just remember, ours is decreasing. Well, let me give you a view of how theirs is constantly improving. I rode on one of these trains. It's fabulous, but I'll just tell you, we were sitting there and I had a cup of water just before we started, and I set it on the windowsill, thinking, before the train goes, I'm going to have to pick that up. Didn't give it a thought, was talking to the person I was traveling with. We, as they say, were going at 500 miles an hour or whatever it is, and that water didn't move. I just want to give you a sense of, if any of you have ridden our trains up and down the East Coast, which is about the only place you have trains every day anymore, to compare that with what they are building and putting in China. So infrastructure can sound boring, but it makes a huge difference. And they are talking about infrastructure for the 21st century, and we're living with our infrastructure from the 19th century. So anyway, it is a huge contrast. So Jonathan, I'm going to start with you. We've had maps, and so everybody's used the term hugely ambitious, however you want to say it. I mean, this is a major change for, half of the world or more if they carry all this through. But I think one of my first questions is, before we get into the policy and everything, is just the practical, which is, how far along do you think they are? I mean, is this just the spark in President Xi's eyes? Would you say they're 5% along? I mean, would you say there's enough going on that you can say, barring wars and whatever, this is going to just move ahead with pretty steady progress? What's your assessment of the likelihood that this is going to go forward as planned, and how far along are they? And how long will it take? Just a few questions.
Sure. No, those are all great questions, and they're difficult to pin down for a few reasons, but let me try. So this initiative was announced, it'll be 5 years ago in September. I think initially when it was announced, some people thought that it would go out the door with President Xi. It looks like he's not leaving anytime soon, so we're stuck with this for a bit longer. And actually, though, according to official statements, this could be something. I find this, though, a little bit hard to believe, but according to official statements, it could be something that goes multiple decades, all the way up to 2049. And so in that sense, we've really just started, we're still in a very early phase. So I think I think there's a lot that could change in that amount of time. In financial terms, I think this is often difficult to pin down because it's unclear exactly what a Belt and Road project is. I focus mainly on infrastructure, but the Belt and Road also includes trade agreements. It includes people-to-people ties. It includes investment. And there's a lot of rebranding that has gone on. So projects that were announced prior to the initiative have been rebranded as Belt and Road projects. China is also pursuing Belt and Road-like activities with partner countries who are not part of the Belt and Road. So India is one of the most skeptical countries, to put it nicely, of the Belt and Road. And China is building an industrial park in India that, were it in Pakistan, would have Belt and Road banners all over the place. The figure $1 trillion often gets put out as a potential for Belt and Road, and it's usually $1 trillion in promised infrastructure. So I think the two key words there are promised, meaning that it hasn't been delivered yet, and infrastructure, which I think is a key part of this, but not the whole thing. In our database, which is just transportation infrastructure, we're tracking about 90 billion, and that's from 2014 to the end of last year. There's another data set that's tracking about 340 billion, which includes construction contracts and investment in Belt and Road countries, so countries that have signed MOUs to participate in the Belt and Road, which is around 70 countries right now. So by that definition, we're about a third of the way there in terms of the promised investment. You hear figures, though, that go as high as $8 trillion, which I think is not realistic to expect. And I think it'll be several more years before we hit the 1 trillion mark.
Okay. Carla, you teased and raised, is this an initiative or is it a strategy? So what's your opinion? And if you think it's a, thank you. If you think it's a strategy, I have a question about, maybe I've been too impressed with how readily, when China makes a plan, they do it. They have these 5-year plans. Is China ready for, do they have an appreciation that everything they do centrally run out of Beijing may work within their border, but that this is all about, if it's a real strategy, this is all about getting others to do what you want them to do. So you think they appreciate that, and how good do you think they're going to be at, if this is a strategy, how good are they going to be at getting others to go along and be part of it?
Well, that's a great question, and you set me up really well. If I can answer, I'll start with the answering this way. It's a very Chinese strategy. I would say it is a strategy, but China has always approached solving problems by setting goals and then finding lots of different ways to achieve them. Deng Xiaoping famously called this crossing the river by feeling the stones. And it's a certain Chinese government pragmatism that has allowed for a lot of experimentation. China's not afraid to experiment, and when things don't work, to move on and to figure out how to learn from mistakes and move forward. I think in China, obviously there are, it's actually quite decentralized despite the unitary political system, and provinces have a fair amount of latitude in making decisions, as do local governments. But as you point out, Janet, is very different when you're dealing with other sovereign states. And so China is going to have to use the incentives of what it argues is a win-win outcome for countries to get them to go along. But there is huge demand for infrastructure. And China's financing approach, which is very different from the way that many other infrastructure projects have been financed in the past. It does use the AAIB, the Asian infrastructure investment bank. This has been mentioned. This is a bank that China led the establishment of a few years ago. It actually hasn't been involved in that many projects, and it has actually many of the projects that it's signed on to, it's doing in conjunction with established multilateral banks like the World Bank and even the Asian Development Bank. But the other way that China finances these projects may be through its own development banks, the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank. And in this case, very often, it's actually lending to its own companies who then go and do the infrastructure project. The danger often is that there are costs associated for the countries involved, deals made between companies and these countries, and so these countries can find themselves in more debt than they can handle, as we've seen recently in Sri Lanka and in some other places. But in many cases, this system really works. And there are some examples, Angola, for example, where China played a major role in developing Angola's oil resources. So I think this is an approach that China has used effectively in many parts of the world, and it feels fairly confident that it can, if the deal is set up the right way, that this can be the basis for a pretty good relationship with these countries down the road or along the rails.
I bet you've used that line before. This could actually be a question for both of you, so maybe each of you wants to comment on, from your experience. But and Tom, I think, hinted that this might be one of the two big questions. Jonathan, you're very focused on literally the infrastructure. What are they doing? Where are they doing it? And where's it all leading? And but there's also, as Tom has raised, there's also the possibility that this is really all about a hinge point in history, that this is all about kind of realigning the geopolitical world, that as Europe and Central Asia looks eastward, the West gets left out. We're on the edge. We're on the periphery. So do you think there is part of this that is really China saying, yes, this is going to be the century of China, and this looks like infrastructure right now, but this is being put in place for a purpose which is without becoming an empire, or nobody wants to be called an empire in the 21st century, but is this really them recognizing that this is meant to be, this is their time, and they're going to rebuild and get back to a time when they were the leading empire in the world?
So I think that there definitely are, I think that is part of the ambition. And I think that it would be wrong to look at this in only economic terms, because although I do think that the economic viability of these projects will dictate some of the political consequences later on, but that these two things go hand in hand. I had the opportunity to go to the Belt and Road Forum in Beijing last May, a year ago last May, and this was one of China's biggest diplomatic events last year. President Xi welcomed representatives from 110 or more countries and international organizations, about 30 heads of state. And it sure felt to me like this was the announcement of something that didn't just have to do with infrastructure. And he walked out on a red carpet, and he spoke, and he referred to the Belt and Road as a project of the century. And so I think that is certainly part of this. And you've, I think there's something powerful about the Belt and Road, because it's a vision it's sold as being a positive economic vision. It's very enticing for a lot of countries for whom development is their number one priority. And so I think you see this this early political success. But whether that is sustainable in the longer run, I'm less certain.
Carla, do you want to comment?
I think that it's outwardly, China is trying to manage expectations about the Belt and Road Initiative. But I think inside China, most Chinese leaders and scholars are pretty convinced that this is going to be a success. And they actually refer to the Belt and Road Initiative internally as the Belt and Road Strategy. And it is not a geopolitical strategy, they will say. They will tell you. It is a geoeconomic, or it's an economic strategy. But of course, then they will sort of wink and say, but of course that has political consequences. They're very aware that this is a power shift in process. I will say that China may want all roads to lead to Beijing the way that they did in Asia once upon a time. But China fundamentally, as a modern state, has a vision that is more multipolar, a recognition that power is probably going to have to be divided. And so it has sought to interact with other major powers around the world on an equal basis. And I think it really could imagine this connectivity through the Belt and Road, in the maritime sphere. It even has an outer space Belt and Road. This is really a planetary vision. I think it sees space for all great powers to work together within this connected set of relationships, largely connected through infrastructure and other technology. It's a vision that hasn't been. We haven't seen anything like this, and I'm not sure it will work. And certainly this is not a vision that the United States has bought into. And even though the China-Russia relationship is closer than it has been since the Sino-Soviet alliance was alive and well, or it's getting that close anyway, it's not clear that Russia is on board either. So in sort of divvying up power, I think that's something that China is going to find very challenging, because not everybody is on board.
Well, follow up then, because one of the questions I have is, and I'll start with you, Carla, then. Tom made reference to it, but clearly the last half of the 20th century, probably the cornerstone of the geopolitical framework was NATO. And true alliance, where one for all and all for one, and if one is attacked, we all, do you see alliances coming out of this? And I would say we're also seeing the rise of nationalism, where people don't want to have alliances and they don't want to be dragged into wars because somebody else gets attacked. So there's kind of countervailing forces there. But do you see this leading to some cross-Asian European, or at least cross-Asian Middle East alliances? Is that part of the strategy, or is that going to be required for it to really succeed?
Right now, Beijing has no alliances along the lines of the alliances that the United States has with Europeans and Japan and South Korea. It does have an alliance relationship with North Korea that has been strained and will expire in 2021. We'll see whether it will automatically renew. But that's not the same kind of an alliance. China has said that it still says, its official position is that it doesn't want to have alliances. But there is a debate now in Beijing, whether, particularly over Sino-Russian relations, about whether or not the world is becoming more hostile and China should consider a deeper partnership with Russia. In relation to the Belt and Road, it's far too early to tell. Everything is moving. There are lots of different visions for connectivity, that some of which Jonathan laid out. There are many different fault lines and other changes in the works. But what you could see happening, and it's interesting, even in Southeast Asia, you are seeing a realignment. Some countries closer to China, some moving closer again to the United States and Japan and Australia. So you're seeing some shifts in that direction. Right now, it's mostly hedging, but you're seeing even in international fora, you're seeing voting patterns that reflect the proximity of economic and related political ties to China, so that countries like Cambodia, for example, are supporting China's position on the South China Sea against other Southeast Asian countries, or even Greece is taking positions now on issues in the United Nations, in the European Union that do not please the farther Western European states.
Jonathan, I've got a few more questions, but I'm getting a cluster of questions in your area, so I think I'll just say that the audience is very interested in actually areas that you sort of touched on. We have several questions about Africa and Southeast Asia, and they're all around, is this going to provide the economic growth that will really, will those areas be the ones most benefited from it? Are they going to provide jobs for the local populations, or is China going to bring Chinese workers in, again, to sort of keep the economy, the individual income of Chinese people improving? So questions around there, Laos and in Southeast Asia, and some of the poorest countries in either Southeast Asia or Africa, are they going to really benefit from this, and what does it mean for them?
So I think I won't speak in great detail to Africa just because it's not, that's not an area where our data has covered yet, so I don't claim to be able to say with certainty about trends there, but I can say some anecdotal evidence. But I think for a lot of countries, Belt and Road it provides an option, and then the question is, do they have other options? And when they do have other options in addition to Belt and Road, I think that is going to be more likely a healthy competition versus some of the situations in which a recipient country could become overly dependent on a donor, in this case, China. So in Southeast Asia, some countries, Indonesia in particular, has been very vocal about this being a great competition for them. They're seeing Japanese companies come in, competing really very strongly with Chinese companies. That's a good position for them to be in. If you're Laos and you've committed to taking on one rail project that they have that's about half of their GDP, that's a risky situation. If you're Sri Lanka and you're unable to pay your debt and you're giving controlling equity stake in a port in a 99-year lease to a foreign country that you never intended to do, that's a riskier situation. And I think some of this comes down to, and this is actually an area where the U.S. could help, is having these recipient countries have the capacity they need to be effective negotiators for themselves, because this is, at the end of the day, a negotiation process. There's lots of political incentives that are involved that are very difficult to manage, but you want to have, the technical experts that are able to read the contracts correctly, and that are able, you want to have the lawyers that are going to be able to argue for having a higher percentage of local labor be involved in the contracts. And so, I've heard anecdotal evidence of some Central Asian governments looking at Africa and saying that's not going to happen to us, and then going into negotiations a little bit harder, trying to get more local labor for some of these Belt and Road projects. But it's a back and forth, and I think to the extent the U.S. and others can provide additional options, I think that would lead to better outcomes.
Carla, I'm going to ask you to put on your glasses and look out about 40 years. Crystal ball, that's what I want to say. Because having read a lot about history, it's a cliche, but there's a lot of evidence to support it. The Middle East is the graveyard of many great empires. The conflicts there eventually bring down all the enterprises who thought they were coming in to bring democracy or to bring an economy or to bring whatever, you just name it. But eventually they get, their militaries and others get buried in the Middle East. So the question is if this, even if this is successful, is this going to improve world relations? That is it going to, we are the Minnesota Peace Initiative. Is it more likely to support peace initiatives or is it more likely to result in more conflicts? So, I mean, do you have any long-range speculation on where this could go or what it could do?
You ask easy questions. Well, that is a key question. 40 years from now, I think it really depends on your view of human nature and your view of the role of economics in influencing the way that whether states choose to support peace or whether states inherently are suspicious of each other and economics don't matter that much in the end, and they'll make decisions to go to war. I think the Chinese believe that economic connections will contribute to peace and stability because they have a developmentalist mindset that economic development is the most important thing to the average person. But they haven't yet confronted a society of people who have enough money. I mean, there are hundreds of millions of middle-class Chinese already, but they are still, they've come from a pretty low level of income in just a few decades, and they haven't started making the kinds of political demands. They aren't yet directly involved in foreign policy and so China hasn't yet had to confront those kinds of choices where there's public pressure, for example, to take action. There are some tests on the horizon. I would argue that Xi Jinping is another populist figure in many ways. He was not anointed by Deng Xiaoping. He had to earn his position by being selected by other senior Chinese party leaders. And so his legitimacy, a lot of it comes directly from the people. And so although in theory and there's a kind of you have to remember that China is still a Marxist, it has a Marxist sort of a way of thinking about the march of history, that China is soon going to be confronted with hundreds of millions of educated Chinese putting pressure on their government to behave in certain ways and respond to international security crises in different ways. And again, you're seeing hints of this. So China's sort of philosophy about what will preserve world peace may change. So I've escaped the big question by looking at China and going into where China is. But I think China philosophically does believe that this will be good for world peace.
Jonathan, we are part of the Norway House, and so for almost every topic, frequently we have experts or speakers here from Norway, but we at least look for whatever kind of connections there might be. And one thing that I know would be interesting is the Arctic. The Arctic leg of this, and some of the things I read about as I was preparing for this tonight also talked about, they didn't talk about Norway, but we can all assume Norway has a dog in that fight. But there's much written that if in fact there is an Arctic connection, that could change this whole thing because it would be shorter and faster, and Russia is more of a player. And it would be just a whole different dynamic. Can you at least say anything in terms of what you know in terms of what is going on with regard to the Arctic connection? Is Norway, Russia, who are the players there? Are we in there, even though we may not choose to be part of the land and sea program of One Belt?
Yeah, so the addition of the Arctic to the Belt and Road is something that happened, I think, basically last year and then was reaffirmed earlier this year. And so, there's talk of a... Sure, yeah. So there's talk of a polar Silk Road now. And, but I think this is for China an area where it's trying to establish more of a legitimate claim. I mean, it is not Norway. I think Chinese officials have pointed to maps from the 1500s, with very large borders. Still not right on the Arctic, but a bit closer, and said, we should be part of these conversations as well. And I think for them, it is probably more in the shorter term. It's probably less about the commercial potential for traffic going through the Arctic and more about the potential for extraction of resources from the Arctic. And so China has, for example, invested in a LNG plant in Russia, but its overall investments in the Arctic are quite small, especially compared to its maritime investments, in the southern part of the Belt and Road. So I think it remains a relatively new and somewhat underdeveloped part of their overall plan.
Do you know, is there enough evidence of the impact of global warming where there is an assumption that we will have an open Arctic passage sooner rather than later? I mean, so it's no longer if this happens, but it is going to. I don't know. I mean, is there an assumption that there is going to be traffic, there is going to be commercial traffic over the top through the Arctic? I don't know.
Yeah, so I think that the assumption is that there will be. There already, every year it seems like there's another first in the Arctic in terms of a vessel going, at a time of the year that had not passed. There are also, the technology also allows ships to get access to areas where they wouldn't have in the past. But I think the question, as many trade questions are, what are the alternatives? What are the alternative routes? And so it's going to be quite some time before the Arctic provides a really longer, dependable, access as competition with some of the existing southern, warmer routes.
Tom, I'm going to ask you to come up now and join us because there are a number of questions from the audience about the U.S. And so I think you have a really important perspective on this. Before we do, while you're getting ready, either one of you can take this, but I think it might be more for you, Jonathan. We always have a particular interest in our audience in the environment and green initiatives. And so we just have one of the members of the audience has just asked, what do we know, if anything, about commitments to a green effort as part of this? Is there any stated positions or stated commitments or anything with regard to this?
Yep. So there's almost nothing that has not been attached to the Belt and Road yet. So think of your exciting adjective, it's probably been mentioned in a Belt and Road policy document. So there is talk about greening the Belt and Road or having a green Belt and Road. Some groups, I think smartly, environmental groups, see this as an opportunity to press China on what it has said is a major priority, and to say that, if you're serious about this, we should be able to measure it in some of the projects that you're doing. And so, I think there are groups that are rightfully pushing to make sure some of these infrastructure projects are environmentally sound. They have environmental assessments, not only in terms of their impact on their surroundings, but also, if it's an energy source, for example, moving away from some of the coal-intensive power plants. But to date, I haven't seen anything that suggests that this is, in fact, yet a green effort. And in fact, the more developed areas of the Belt and Road, the China-Pakistan economic corridor in particular, involve a lot of coal power plants. And so I think that's definitely an area where there's room for improvement.
Yeah, I wanted to comment. First, Just a funny or an interesting factoid that I came across, and some of the work, the collaboration that China may engage in with Norway in the Arctic has some significant environmental consequences and might be interesting for this audience to follow. One involves a rail line that could disrupt, for example, the reindeer migration. So there are things happening in the Arctic that have significant environmental consequences, and that is the other thing I was going to say is that China considers itself a near Arctic country, and it has numerous icebreakers and is really poised to exploit this route. On the environmental side, China's development overseas historically has not been very environmentally friendly. Basically, the modus operandi for its firms doing these big infrastructure development firms is, whatever rules are on the books in the country that it's operating in, those are the rules those companies are supposed to follow. But this is starting to change as some of these firms become the leading firm in, the biggest company in the world. For example, China's hydropower, one of its hydropower companies, Sino-Hydro, is the world's largest hydropower company. And so because they are now out in the lead, they are actually integrating, best practices for environmental and social impact assessments and so forth. But it's very uneven, and so something that's important to watch. And we keep saying, well, the AIIB has high environmental standards, so that will help lift the standards that are deployed in developing the Belt and Road around the world. But that's not necessarily the case, and people have visited Laos and other parts of poorer parts of the world where these projects are being constructed are very concerned.
Okay, we have, as I said, a number of questions about the United States and our role. And I will say, and I think we've tried to say this at past programs, whenever you're dealing with hot topics right out of the news, and especially in a really polarized political environment like we have, our goal is not to be pointing fingers or casting aspersions, but it is to try to help the audience understand where are we going, what's the likelihood we're going to get there. And so we have a number of questions from our audience, and I'll start, Tom, with you, which is, are we going to get left out in the cold? For that kind of summary, I mean, are we going to be, by the time we do or don't decide on a new or different strategy, anyway, are we going to get left out in the cold?
In other words, in trying to take a more, shall we say, unilateral approach to some issues, we end up isolating ourselves instead. Well, that remains to be seen. All this is very new. These are deep changes that are happening rapidly. I think if you look at China with its capacity to plan long term, it's a country that traditionally has been ruled by engineers, not lawyers so much. And so, they are setting out long-term goals to be the world leader in high-tech and AI by 2030. They have 200-year anniversaries of the Communist Party and of the People's Republic itself in, I think, 2021 and 2049, that a lot of this is geared to. This is long-term planning. And I think there's a theory that if you're approaching complex systems, there's a period of scanning in which you try different approaches, and that's what we seem to be doing. We are changing our approach. There's a certain amount of uncertainty in what we're doing. We've gone from trying to make China a responsible stakeholder to pivoting to hedge against it under Obama to now this focus on trade and trying to counter what they're doing in the global economy. So we have to somehow develop a strategy, a set of priorities, keep our ends and our means in balance, and go forward in a serious manner. If we don't develop that capacity, I think we do risk isolating ourselves. And I'm personally very concerned that on a number of issues right now, we're going to be driving away our European allies, which I think are really an important part of our power projection right now in the world.
We have another question, which is, and you can never go home again, but one, should we have stayed in the TPP, or should we try to negotiate a new TPP? I mean, clearly some of the members of the audience want to know a little bit more about, we kind of had one thing, anyway, would that be one of the strategies that we might be thinking about?
I do think we gave up a lot. This was an effort we pushed for, beginning with the George Bush administration, and it was very difficult politically for many of our allies and our partners. I happened to be in Beijing when the announcement was made of the decision that the United States would no longer participate in the TPP. I was in the Vietnamese embassy in Beijing, and the minister counselor I was speaking with was apoplectic. It had been a very, very politically costly effort by the Vietnamese to push membership through. Similarly, for Japan, this was a terrible disappointment. Well, we are not part of the TPP, but the TPP goes on. There's a new TPP 11 that has been formed, and we're not at the table. And this is going to it's still tied now to Asia, not to North America, because Japan is the largest economy in this new TPP 11. So I think we lost a lot. We had an opportunity to push trade to a new level, to set new and to green trade in a way through the TPP that has been, at least we're not part of the effort going forward, and it's not clear that this TPP 11 will have all of the elements that we had pushed for in the original TPP.
I mean, the TPP, in my view, was partly a political response to a Chinese trade initiative in Asia that would have excluded us. And at the moment when we realized that countries like Japan were interested in going forward with that, I think the Obama administration then responded with the TPP. We already had very close trade relations with all those countries anyway, but symbolically, it was quite damaging to pull out the way we did, added to this sense of uncertainty coming out of the United States right now. I find it very ironic that we are right now using aspects of the TPP that we negotiated as templates for renegotiation of NAFTA, which is kind of an irony. We might as well, and I know we've talked about maybe going back into the TPP, but on the basis of renegotiating it, and the 11 countries, I believe, are saying no, we're not going to renegotiate.
Ironically, China may join this TPP 11.
Now, this question is swinging to the other side, which is if the BRI is good for all the countries in it, will the U.S. not being involved hinder it? Would our being in it actually help support it? So I mean, sort of the opposite spectrum, not from what's good for us or our perspective, but would it also help the implementation of the initiative or strategy, depending upon how you want to call it? Does it make a difference that we're not in it, I guess, is the question.
So I mean, my personal view is that the U.S. need not fully support nor fully oppose the Belt and Road, and I think that makes sense for a few reasons. One being that this thing is so big and expansive and vague and changing still that we're really not sure what we're signing up for if you do, support the entire thing as some countries have done. With a whole variety of experiences, some countries have signed on and done essentially no projects. Others have done many projects. And then I think the U.S. need not oppose it because in opposing it in its entirety, I think we would create divisions among some countries that would like to have relations with us, or we'd push them away. We shouldn't be making them choose necessarily. And so I think the answer for the U.S. is more to offer its own positive economic vision. I think TPP should have been part of that. The free and open Indo-Pacific is the sort of the new concept, but without a lot of operational detail yet. And it also misses huge chunks of Europe. So I think that can't be the only thing. But I guess I would encourage somewhat of a nuanced position for the U.S.
I just want to add that in a way we are already participating in the BRI. In some projects there is a lot of U.S. investment, and perhaps Tom can talk about this in more detail, but I'm thinking about the port on the Black Sea in Georgia, where it's considered sort of part of the Belt and Road, but when the tender went out for bid, it was a U.S. company and another company that won the bid, partly because we offered a better plan for employment of locals than the Chinese plan. So we are participating in some ways by investing in some of these projects. Our companies are, so I think there are opportunities for us to continue to do that, and as in this example, to actually set a higher standard.
And there are also companies like Caterpillar, which have been quite involved so far. We had a high official from the Department of Commerce out here a few months ago talking about Russia sanctions, and privately this person indicated that Commerce is not really allowed to inform U.S. business about the Belt and Road. He expressed great frustration about that because there are a lot of opportunities. I'm a little worried if, not that documents should be taken at face value, but our strategy documents now, each one, the military doctrine that's coming out now, our new nuclear posture, the national strategic strategy, I think are indicating we want to actively oppose what China's doing. And I hope that that's not true. I hope that those are just words. In this strategy document, it says it was a mistake to bring China into the global economy. It was a fool's errand. We thought they would change, and they didn't. We should not have made them responsible stakeholders. And we talk about actively opposing some of their policies. Now, as the tariff situation develops, South China Sea, there are a number of areas right now where the relationship could get very, very complicated. And I think we need to focus on the importance of keeping this very important relationship on track. China is the rising power of this age, and historically, there's often war when you have a rising power and a status quo power. And to that extent, history is against us. The Chinese have talked about this in summits with our leaders, that we have to act against the historical patterns here. I'm just a little concerned that it's going the wrong way at present.
Well, we have a couple of questions that go right to that, and again, they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. One of our very ambitious investors in the audience has asked, are these projects going to provide opportunities for investment by any global investors, but individual investments? Is this going to be an opportunity to make money? I will tell you just from personal experience, I did a lot of preparing for tonight, and I think I read a monograph on this from every single major investment house there. So they are clearly talking about funds to support this. But anyway, so did anybody else want to comment?
Sure. So I think there is. I mean, if we're talking about investing in Asian infrastructure broadly, I think there's a huge need for that. And the need far exceeds anything that China itself is going to be able to put on the table. So even Belt and Road in its most inflated numbers, the $8 trillion number that I don't really believe, the need for infrastructure in developing Asia alone, 2016 to 2030 is $26 trillion. So that leaves a huge gap for others to invest in. I think there's lots of barriers to mobilizing private investment for these projects. If we think about where these projects are, infrastructure projects are typically, they cost more than estimated initially. They usually take longer to complete than expected, and they usually deliver fewer benefits than expected, and that's in the best business environments. And we're talking about some really difficult areas to do business. And so I think it's natural that there would be some reluctance among the private sector investors to put money in there, but that is an area where the U.S. does have an interest, especially among pension funds and other institutional investors. And if there is a way for the U.S. government other partner countries to help de-risk some of those investments by putting a small amount of money on the table and mobilizing a bigger pool of private sector investment, that's certainly something that people are very interested in exploring.
We also, on the other end of the spectrum from risk and reward, we'll go to the risk side, actually several questions about military spending. What do we know about China's military spending? One of the questions is, all of this development, we're always arguing about oil and resources and having the energy to support all this development. Is this project going to create enough new energy, or are we just going to have more players fighting over resources? So, I mean, I've kind of combined 2 or 3 questions there, but it's more about the risk side, the darker side of the next 40 years.
Well, China's military is growing rapidly. China just underwent a military reform that to make its military look a lot more like ours, a much more integrated force. And one of the forces that it's expanding rapidly is its navy. And this is an increasingly global navy, and we're going to see China's submarines all around North America very soon. They're everywhere, and so this is a really a new world where China can put its forces all over the world. China has so far not stationed troops anywhere. It doesn't. I think we have something like 800 bases around the world. China doesn't have bases. It does have peacekeepers. It just expanded its peacekeeping commitments to I think 8,000 from 2,500, and its peacekeepers are sometimes in places where China, they like to send them where China has some investments. There are some links there, but so far China hasn't projected force with soldiers to protect its assets, its investments. But this is starting to change. There are rumors of Chinese troops in Central Asia here and there, and it is possible that as the stakes get higher, as China's investments get higher, that it will feel it needs to secure them if they aren't being secured by the countries that China has invested in. Pakistan is providing, for example, a lot of troops along, and maybe this is not accurate, but I've read that along this key part of the Belt and Road, it's supplying troops to safeguard some of those areas where construction is going on in very unstable regions. So, once you set a precedent, that precedent can be repeated elsewhere. So we have a rapidly changing situation where China's military is modernizing more than as much as growing, and if you read its plans, it's expanding into space, it's expanding on the seas, and it is becoming a more and more sophisticated force. But of course, China hasn't fought a war since we engaged China in Vietnam, and the Chinese and Vietnamese have fought battles of a number of different places, but China has very limited fighting experience. So it's going to take a very, very long time before China has a military anywhere remotely near as professional as ours.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Carla said that. I mean, the increases in their defense spending are starting from a lower base, and we far outspend them still. And with the latest defense increases, even more so as we head up towards $750 billion on spending per year. China has focused up till now on Taiwan and on the waters around Taiwan. This is an area of concern. I think it's as important, if not more so, to China. Certain steps we've taken recently are kind of upping the profile. My understanding is that as part of the 2049 anniversary, there's every expectation that by then Taiwan would be part of China. There's no timetable, but it's clear this is still foremost in their minds. China does not have a strong naval tradition. I mean, the Empress Dowager, I think in 1912, spent the entire budget on a stone ship that you can still see in the Summer Palace. China was often ruled by inland foreign empires that really did not see the value in a strong navy. So they're coming from way behind to challenge us here.
We're going to close with hopefully a question on optimism, but does anyone want to just give a very short, what is the issue about oil? I mean, if we have solar energy, that's great, but the point is all these growing economies are going to be demands on whatever natural resources we now have to fuel those economies. So is this going to make the competition for petroleum-based products even worse, or are we going to find lots of new petroleum-based products and have pipelines to move it wherever we want, or what's going to be the future there?
Well, I'll give it a shot. I think, energy security for China is key, and it's an important reason that for China's role in the Belt and Road. It started to have to import oil in 1993, and since then has worked hard to establish relationships with countries and build pipelines to ensure that it wouldn't get caught in a crisis. It wouldn't have to confront the Malacca dilemma, that is getting its oil imports blocked in the Malacca Strait, but it still remains very vulnerable. You're talking, though, about supplies of oil and whether countries will need to develop based on oil resources. That's possible, but I think we're also on the verge of quite possibly an energy revolution. And I know I was just reading about China's exports of solar farms to Africa to power some of its developments there. There are other green technologies that China is experimenting with. And one of the things about China is it's diversified its energy resources. It still consumes a lot of oil. It's still a coal-based economy, and it's importing more and more gas. But it has also put an enormous amount of money into developing nuclear, hydro, but also wind power and solar, and so much so that it's brought the price down of those products quite low, and they are now able to be deployed all over the world. That said, many countries will go to the carbon old style energy sources where technology is simple, straightforward, and easy to get.
So more demand on.
So possibly more demand, but these projects are going to take decades, and it may be by then we have some options.
Okay.
I think that oil, gas, natural resources are a big part of the Russia-China story. It's something that brings them together. In addition to all the geopolitical aspects we've been talking about, there'll be pipelines coming out of Russia if this northern route gets going. Which way Russia goes in this whole equation will be very important. Right now, they're drifting away from Europe. As we know, they're drifting away from the West. There are still a lot of tensions with China, but they are getting closer. I know for some analysts in Washington, pushing China and Russia together is maybe not the best approach for U.S. foreign policy. If you add Iran to the mix, you get Zbigniew Brzezinski always said that the one thing that could threaten the U.S. is if we ever manage to bring Russia, China, and Iran into the same orbit. I think we have to keep these things in mind.
Okay, well, we're going to close with a quick round. Does this have staying power? Is this just a lifetime dream of Xi, or is this really a hinge of history? It's going to be a major investment and strategy, and it's going to dominate the 21st century. And feel free to say yes or no, or either or, whichever you think. Okay.
So I'm, as might be evident by now, I am, I think both. I think the ambition of this vision is staggering, but I also think that the degree of difficulty in many of these countries is also quite high. And so I think we have to expect that many of these projects will fail. But it's a slow-moving set of issues that we're talking about. It'll take years for these projects to unfold. The ones that are completed, it will take even more years to decide whether they were productive economic investments, and the world can change a lot in the meantime.
Yeah, I think the vision will have considerable staying power, but I think that it will be trimmed over time. Right now there is it's like the gold rush. There are a lot of countries and companies are rushing to take advantage of the momentum this concept has brought to infrastructure development. And over time, priorities will change. There'll be more Sri Lankas out there, and countries will reassess. But I think we're going to see considerable momentum in Eurasia. And I think so. I think the vision for these transportation corridors in at least linking China, India, Pakistan, and maybe Russia to Western Europe, that maybe they'll only get to Central Europe, but that will I think we'll see that in the next couple of decades.
I think in the short term, it's hard to say how fast this will go. There could be obstacles. But if you look longer term, just at the underlying factors, the technology exists now to do this kind of project, especially the rail technology and beyond. Demographically, I tell my students always, by the end of the century, and many of them will still be alive, the demographics of the world will be quite different. Between Africa, India, and China, you'll have the bulk of the human population. How can this region not be the center going forward? It just seems to me that the deeper trends are there, and countries are already beginning to compete in this effort, and I think that will also speed up. And final point, I spend a fair amount of time in Europe, and I have been struck by the at least initial buy-in for this in places like Prague, which will be amazingly, the French finance minister said 2 months ago that France believes that the transatlantic era is coming to an end, and that France must look to rebalance by participating in the construction of a backbone across Eurasia, stretching from Europe to Beijing via Moscow. That's the French finance minister. So short term, we'll see, but long term, I think this is the world that our children and grandchildren will inherit.
Okay, well, thank you very much for a fascinating conversation. We have a thank you gift that we hope you will cherish forever, and that I hope every time you look at it, you will think about the evening you had here tonight. We have, for each of our speakers, and we have is a Minnesota Native American peace pipe made out of pipestone, which is in our state, the stone. And this is a symbol of the peace and the effort to listen and hear each other. And that is the goal of our programs. And so we hope you will cherish this and see the symbolism of it. We appreciate all of the experts who come from around the world to our programs, and we want them to have something very special to remember us by as well. So there'll be one for each of you. And as I say on every program, I'll save you from being frisked by TSA. We will mail it to your offices. So anyway. We also want to thank the Planning Committee and Larry Bakken, if you would please stand. We don't, all of our committee members have gotten very shy, so none of them all want to stand. But Larry Bakken is on the board of the Norway House, and he is the chairman of our Planning Committee, and we all want to thank the entire Planning Committee for all the effort that they've put in. So let's give them a round of applause. I mentioned our sponsoring organizations at the opening, and in light of the time, I'm going to just ask everyone from our sponsoring organizations, the China Business Association, Fredrickson Law Firm, Global Minnesota, will you please stand so we can thank you for your support? And finally, we want to thank everyone involved in the Norway House, from the board to the executive team, everyone that gives us great support for our committee. We appreciate it very much. I remind everyone at each of our programs, we are raising money for a new Norway House. We have a Norway House on Franklin and 10th, and we have lots of programs there, and there's a good website, and so I encourage everyone to go on the Norway House website to learn more about it. But we will one day, just like China, one day we'll make it happen. We are going to have a new Norway House. John Peterson is here. He's the chair of the committee and of the board, and so we appreciate all the efforts that are being made. But one day we will hold our programs in the gathering room of our Norway House. So we are all looking forward to that. And then the last thing I would say is thank you all very much. We have a committee, and if you want to join, and I invite anybody who has comments, who wants to join our committee, we will have our next program in the fall, and it will be another great panel, and it'll be another hot topic, and it'll be another fascinating evening in which we can all live and learn and listen. So I hope all of you will be there, and thank goodness I don't have to say, be careful in the snow. We're finally beyond that. So safe travels, and I hope you'll stay and talk to our panelists. They'll stay and answer any questions you have. And most importantly, I hope you, now as you read any of these articles, and there was just one in the New York Times on Sunday, and there'll be many, many more on the One Belt strategy, you will think, I know something about that. All righty, take care. Good evening.